Thank you very much indeed to our witnesses for being with us today to better inform our thinking in this particular matter of the border in the island of Ireland. Before we get into questions, I wonder if perhaps you might very briefly describe who you are, where you're coming from, starting with Mr. Henig.
I'm David Henig. I'm a trade policy specialist. I work with the trade policy think tank European Centre for International Political Economy, and I've been working on trade issues for 10 years or so.
Dr. Tannam.
I'm Etain Tannam. I'm Associate Professor in Trinity College Dublin in International Peace Studies, and I'm working on a book on British-Irish relations in the 21st century. So my particular area, I suppose, is British-Irish diplomacy, intergovernmental cooperation and cross-border.
Good morning, I'm Colin Murray. I'm a reader in public law at Newcastle Law School, and I'm working as part of an ESRC funded project team on Northern Ireland related aspects of Brexit.
Thank you. If I can start and exercise my privilege as chairman in firing the first question at you. We've heard evidence in the course of our work around the possibility of technical and systems-based solutions to ensuring we have no hard border in the island of Ireland after Brexit. And we've heard from experts such as Lars Carlson, Hans Meissen, Christian Bock, who I think were very compelling in what they had to say in relation to ways in which we might avoid this hard border that no politician wants to see, so that that border looks and feels in the future pretty much as it does today, and as we found during our recent committee visit to Strabane, and very beautiful it was too, and we want to make sure it remains like that. So my question to you really is, because you will no doubt have taken note of the evidence that we have heard and certainly seen some of it reported, what your attitude is to the possibility that we can use so-called alternative arrangements in order to avoid the very close regulatory and tariff convergence, which appears otherwise to be the solution to avoiding that border changing its nature. I wonder perhaps, Mr. Henig, if you might like to kick off with that.
Okay, sure. So I don't rule out that these solutions can play a part in the future. However, I put a timescale on it somewhere different to the timescale that others have put on it. I would suggest that you could envisage these sort of solutions playing a part and ensuring there was no border, and we still had rights to have different regulations in perhaps 10 years plus. Now, if that feels like a long time in the future, I want to explain why that's my view. Well, it does. But so let's just bear in mind first that there is no country outside of the EU where there is no border infrastructure. So there's the only place where border infrastructure has been removed is within the EU. Now, the EU has said within the BrExit talks that actually we can not be a member of the EU and have no border infrastructure if we stay close to regulation. So that's the first crack. We've actually been offered something that nobody else has been offered already, so that's a starting point. However, what I think we need to bear in mind is that the border is at the centre of all customs and regulatory checks that currently happen for products going into the EU or into any country, which is to say that the border is the only place where the transport, the goods, the paperwork can be guaranteed to all be together. Now, if you are going to remove that possibility to have all of those together, you are going to need to put in place a very strong set of systems and processes. This is not just about the technology, to make sure that everything that is currently done at the border, and that is far more than just customs, can be done elsewhere and can be done in such a way as to ensure that you don't have a huge increase in smuggling and people basically not paying their customs or smuggling in products that are not allowed. And, for example, should the UK do a trade deal with the US and have different meat, have hormone-treated beef or whatever it is, this would the EU would say that was a major part of what they want to do to make sure that that could not come into the EU. How do you do that without having border infrastructure? I don't doubt that that's possible. This is not just primarily about technology. This is a process question. How do you actually make sure you go through all the processes, you build up all the trust, you build up all the legal systems possible, such that both sides are completely sure that you can do this? And I'm afraid that if we look at how long technology solutions take, and before I was in trade, I actually started my career in IT. It is real. Let us put realistic timescales on this. The e-borders system, which the Home Office commissioned in the early 2000s, and in 2014 admitted would never, in fact, be fully operational. These systems take a long time. The processes take a long time. The trust building takes a long time. So I don't doubt it can be. I don't doubt it can be done. And that actually puts me at odds with quite a lot of customs experts who say it can never be done. But I don't doubt it can be done, but it will take a long time.
Hans Meissen thought it could be done in 2 years using a bespoke system. He, I think, admitted that no such system currently exists because there's no real need for such a thing, because the border in Ireland is pretty much unique in relation to the security imperatives and so on. So the difference between you and him appears to be 8 years, which is a hell of a lot. And I'm wondering why you've chosen 10 years to suggest that perhaps we might be able to be there, because if you admit that there is a possibility, technically, conceptually, of dealing with this in a remote way or a systems-based way, then why should it take so long? You're simply relying upon precedent, that is to say how long, for example, it's taken to establish e-borders.
To me, for the complexity of the question is why it takes so long. This is not just about the technology. If it was just about the technology and if it was easy to put in a solution, I'm quite sure that Norway and Sweden, who would like to have no border infrastructure, I'm quite sure that they would have done it already. This is not just about technology, even though that is unproven. This is about processes, this is about trust, this is about legal frameworks, shared operations. These things, in my experience, internationally, take a lot of time. And both sides, the UK and the EU, need to have full trust that any system you put in place works to a very high degree of confidence.
Does goodwill come into it?
Sorry?
Goodwill.
I'm quite sure that goodwill will come into it. And if both sides work together with goodwill and you build up, I'm quite sure, in fact, that's the only way you can do this. You will not do it without that goodwill.
On day one after Brexit, then there will be complete regulatory and tariff alignment. That's clearly the case, since it takes a very long time for these things to diverge. Under such circumstances, both parties are going to have to take a risk-based approach to the way they deal with this particular border. The WTO makes that quite clear. It also makes quite clear that we can have derogations based upon national security, which may very well apply here. Can you see any circumstances at all in which either party would wish to see any infrastructure on that border after Brexit?
I'm sure that initially neither side wishes to see infrastructure on the border, and I've been reading widely on the subject of it, that both Irish commentators and UK commentators have been putting on the subject that initially neither side will want to do it, but that pressure will build. There is a matter of trust, I think, between the sides. We already have cases where EU has questions about the way the UK handles, for example, customs. We have there was a case recently about Chinese imports not paying the right customs. I think that pressure would build from the EU side in particular, but don't discount it building on the UK side, to say, what is actually coming through this border? How are we managing it? We are going to have to put something in place. Now, I don't know what something is, and I don't think that most people wish to speculate too much about what that something may be in the hope that that is not required. But I'm quite sure that in some dusty corridors in both Dublin and in this city, I'm quite sure that people are thinking about this and thinking about how you could possibly do it without causing big political problems.
Bob, you want to make a quick point?
On this point, two things. I'd like you to describe what the Swedish-Norway border is like, because my impression was that it was pretty fluid. And as I live sometimes on the French-Swiss border at Geneva, and particularly in Fenny-Voltaire, where we have a flat, I don't see any problem going across the border there between a non-EU country and an EU country. And it worries me that you're saying 10 years too, because actually you haven't answered the question as to why it takes 10 years. Why it would take 10 years. That's twice the length of the Second World War.
Well, let's take those in turn. So, as I understand it, from both the Norway-Sweden border and the Swiss border, I've crossed the Swiss border from both Austria and Italy, and there is quite clearly infrastructure where I've crossed it. Now, my understanding is that there are crossings which do not have that infrastructure.
They go straight through. They go straight through.
Well, I was stopped on both occasions.
Yeah, on occasion.
So there is infrastructure in both cases, and I think that where there on the crossings that there is not infrastructure, that goods are not allowed to cross, and I'm quite sure that there is surveillance sitting behind that as well. So that is why. Why have I not given an explanation for 10 years? It's very difficult to describe why diplomacy, trust, systems all take so long. Why do trade deals take 10 years to agree? In theory, people have proved that you could write a trade deal in a morning. But for both sides to agree, to find out exactly what you want, to get to a position where you have what are we wanting here? 99% trust that this is secure, takes time. It takes the action of the law. It takes both sides to have trust in each other. It takes the systems and both sides to have systems to agree what those systems are, for the technology to be tested, for traders to have confidence. And there's been some very good reports about how the systems that are proposed will require traders to have a technology fitted to their vehicles, which they may not wish to do initially. There are a lot of questions to a major systems change. These things, I'm afraid, do take a long time. This is not something. It would be nice, and we see so often in government. We've seen in the past systems where we think it will take a year, or the government department says it will take a year or 2 years, and it ends up taking 10 years. Now, that's just an optimism bias that system people in government can have. I'm trying to be more realistic here. And as I say, some people say this could never be done. I'm trying to be more optimistic, but to give you a realistic view of how long and why it will take that length of time. Do we want to do this properly? I think it can be done, but I don't think it can be done if you assume that it can all be done tomorrow. That is my view.
Mr. Murray, you look like you're gagging to get in at this point.
It's very much a point, Dr. Morrison, on regulatory alignment and the day one alignment that the UK will find itself in on leaving the EU. But by day two, we're told that trade deals will be in place internationally and they will continue to roll on day 3, 4, 5 for the UK. And every one of those trade deals will involve exactly those negotiations that Mr. Henig is talking about. That relationship between states looking for advantage over things like regulations, and there will be progressive regulatory disalignment or de-alignment between the UK and the EU. You can go through Hans Meissen and Lars Carlson's evidence. There is scant mention of regulation, scant mention of it. We can be optimistic, perhaps, as to a customs border having a technological solution, but that is a customs barrier to trade. It is not a non-tariff barrier. The solutions that you have been presented with do not deal with the complexity of 21st century trade. So much of that lies in non-tariff barriers.
Could you expand a little bit on that? Because I think we're all familiar with what non-tariff barriers are, but perhaps some of us are struggling to work out why it is that we can't interact properly north-south and indeed east-west after Brexit, once we've sorted out the mechanics of what happens on the border, because the uniqueness of the island of Ireland in respect of Brexit is, of course, the security implications of a functioning proper border of the sort that we are used to elsewhere. That clearly can't be allowed in the context of Ireland. And I'm not quite sure where the issue is that specifically relates to the island of Ireland, the sort you're describing?
Well, there is more of an issue than security. There is the Belfast Agreement set up of north-south bodies and the idea of a completely frictionless, invisible border that works on. If a patient in a Belfast hospital needs a rare set of blood platelets, that product has in the past been imported from the Republic of Ireland. It's on record as happening.
Why could it not still be? After Brexit, if there was cooperation and agreement, why could it not still be? Are you saying that the hospital, they would refuse to send it if it was needed?
We are sitting on top of a contaminated blood scandal going back to the 70s and 80s, and the movement of blood products across borders from the European Union into a non-member state is now very heavily regulated. There is no way without deep regulatory alignment where there will be the level of trust that has been talked about already to maintain that quick and easy flow of a vital product like that across a border.
That is the most appalling Sir Humphrey indictment.
Exactly.
It is inconceivable that people would be allowed to suffer because some bureaucrat somewhere is insisting on a particular set of standards.
But it is inconceivable that after the contaminated blood scandal of the 70s and 80s that we would allow blood to or blood-related products like platelets to pass over the border with no regulation and checks. It is exactly the situation that led
I'm not getting at you, but it's important to make this very clear because there's a lot of shroud waving going on around this particular business. A country like the United Kingdom, as is and as it will be, and a bloc like the European Union, as it currently is and will continue to be, will continue to operate closely and I imagine respect each other's standards. It is inconceivable that in respect of what you have just described, there will be a significant level of divergence. Would you not accept that? Or are you envisaging a future in which standards in the United Kingdom vastly exceed those in the European Union, or indeed, on the flip side of that, is that they in some way sink into some sort of antediluvian state of disrepair to the point at which our neighbours in Europe would say that we are not going to be taking dirty products from the United Kingdom. Is that really what you're saying?
I'm really saying that ripping up EU red tape as regulatory barriers were put in place was a huge part of what the Brexit offer was. And that as soon as...
There's products you can't bring across. Premature babies in border in Northern Ireland, they can't be fed on the breast milk brought in from the Republic of Ireland. You're not allowed to bring them over the border. There's all sorts of things which you currently can't do in this wonderful world of the EU.
Yes, and that's within a highly integrated
You mentioned
single
smuggling.
market.
Smuggling's at its all-time high within the EU. Not only in our border, but across other EU borders.
And I think that that's where the legal and the trust comes in. You've built up certain frameworks over time where, frankly, certain yes, there is
this
still
isn't perfection.
yes, there is still.
Europe isn't a mess.
I'm going to bring some order to the proceedings. I'm going to reassure our witnesses that although we all get very excited about this matter, we are in no way aiming that excitement at you, but merely at the issues. Can I bring you Dr. Tannam? Very quickly, yes.
Yeah, so going back to the blood scandal, so is it not true that the Republic of Ireland had to pay out £1.5 billion in compensation due to a hepatitis C blood scandal? So is the reverse not true as well, that the standards in the Republic of Ireland have had a questionable history too?
And this is where the standards have moved on, and those issues from the 1980s, but those standards are now based
this was only
in...
last year.
Yes, the payout was last
euros.
year
Yeah.
for a historic scandal.
Yeah, so you cannot say
but
that the Republic of Ireland has a robust, as a member of the EU, has a robust safety history.
But I can say going forward that now, as a matter of EU regulation, these products are fully regulated in light of those scandals happening.
The people of Northern Ireland have confidence in the arrangements for the blood products from the Republic of Ireland. The same can exactly be said for the blood history from the United Kingdom. I think that's a very, very malicious comment to make in this committee.
Right. Well, I think the point is made, and I'm going to proceed to Dr. Tannam. You're obviously an expert in relationships between north-south and east-west. which is obviously germane to the points that have just been made. Now, clearly, it's in the interests of all parties to this that after Brexit, we continue with a high level of trust that has already been referred to. Indeed, the experts we have heard from already rely upon, in making their cases, a high level of trust, particularly between the UK and the Republic of Ireland, which must endure. I wonder what reflections you might have on that.
I just wanted to say something about the previous point by Mr. Paisley, and also about the scandals that happen everywhere. I think there is, Mr. Paisley's correct, there's a polarisation at the moment that we have a sort of no border, whereas actually there is a border, there's different currencies, different systems. Trinity, my department, actually has a department in Belfast, a section of it, and we come up against these issues all the time. But Professor John Bradley has argued, formerly of the SRI, that Brexit makes the situation worse. So it's not that it's perfect. Cross-border cooperation has not been perfect. Trade is not as high as we might like in a way, but just to say it doesn't mean, I think that means, oh, then it's fine, because actually the fear is things will get worse. So I just wanted to add that. Yeah. Yet trust is hugely important. I know when the Brexit referendum was called, I, for one, thought the British-Irish relationship would continue the way it had been, and that was the key to smoothing over all the other issues and to reaching agreements that would be helpful for the border and would avoid worst-case scenarios. I think all of us have seen there's been tension in the British-Irish relationship since the Brexit referendum, and there's been rhetoric at times on both sides, and media portrayals and stereotypes that have reoccurred. So I think it's been very negative.
Jim.
Pardon?
Brexit here is going to hell. We've got an example on words,
Yeah, no, on both sides. Yes.
I know you accepted that.
Order. Jim, we'll come to you in a minute.
Yeah, I think there have been stereotypes on both sides, which have not been helpful. But at the same time, the British and Irish governments, I believe, have actually come together relatively well, particularly over the past 18 months. I mean, I think we all are aware, and you are aware of this more than I am, of strategies and bargaining and when to be blunt and when not to be blunt. But overall, I think there's been relatively good management and diplomacy being used, and I think that's been very positive. At the beginning, it seemed a bit less so at times, but there has been, I think there's a common interest in trying to resolve this issue, even though preferences are so different. And after, at various times, I know the Taoiseach, Simon Coveney, has been very sympathetic to Theresa May's position, for example. So the sort of hardline rhetoric, I would argue, overall has declined. But there needs to be, I would argue, a formalisation of relations more going forward, because we have seen how quickly relations can decline.
Yes.
And I was quite shocked by that, actually, at the beginning, after the referendum.
Yes, and of course we're all going to be left, aren't we, after this, however it ends up, with two jurisdictions that are going to have to continue to cooperate very closely. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you might indulge me for one moment. Some of us have spent quite a lot of time over the past few years commemorating the centenary of the Great War, and just by way of diversion, I would say that is an example of where we've been able to bring two countries much closer together, and communities have been much closer together, and it's been very heartening to see how that is possible, and particularly since the Queen's visit and the President's visit in 2012. There's no doubt that mutual sympathy has grown very substantially, using those sort of tools of soft diplomacy. After Brexit, to what extent do you think it will be we will be able to easily perhaps repair some of the inevitable damage that has been done between the relations between the two countries, and how do you think that might be achieved?
I think it's very possible, and I think there is a political will to do that. And the example, we've had very bad times, obviously, in British-Irish history and Northern Irish history over centuries and decades. So I think we've come through, and we have a very strong relationship still, despite the tensions at the moment. So I think the first point is that, yes, it's possible to do it, and I hope probable. There's a basic question. I was talking to a retired person from the Cabinet Office here about 18 months ago as well, and he was arguing about institutions. Do they reflect political will, or do they create it? And there is that question. as is my academic and my personal belief, is we need more robust institutions and more robust use of the Good Friday Agreement's institutions to preserve cooperation. Again, because it really did decline quite quickly after the Brexit referendum. So if that can happen on foot of the Queen's visit and very, other remarkable events historically, then I think we need to protect that very much institutionally. So I think there needs to be that commitment to use the Good Friday Agreement's institutions, all strands, and also perhaps to develop new bilateral agreements or some other format, which has been mentioned by Theresa May as well, I think, and also by our government.
Just can I come in on that? I worked very closely when I was within the UK government. I worked very closely with the Irish government on trade issues, and I think that one of the things I note in trade negotiations, if you like, is that trade negotiations tend to bring out what divides you rather than what you agree on, and that something that we really have to be much to improve in the next phase is to make sure that while we're having these disagreements, which we will have over inevitably with our EU colleagues, is to make sure that we have in place strong underpinning relations. And it's not just with Ireland. We had a number of countries around the EU who we had very close relations with, the likes of Sweden or the Netherlands, and we need to make sure that those are continued. I think, and I agree, probably to put more effort into building closer relations with officials. One of the places we used to meet Irish officials a lot was in Brussels. Now that's not going to happen. How do we make sure that UK officials and Irish officials continue to have dialogue when we will no longer meet as often as we do now?
But could I just stress, because I think bilateral relations with every country Britain has close relations with now are important, but with Ireland there's the Northern Irish post-conflict situation where British-Irish cooperation is so vital to underpin.
Yes, you're absolutely right. It's a special case. Okay, Gregory Campbell.
You're very welcome. I was just going to press the rewind button there, Chairman.
I
was going to press the rewind button and get us back to 9:30 to start over again. I'm wondering, maybe Dr. Henig, the first question, were you aware of, it was a report which in the Irish Times appeared a couple of months ago, quoting reliable sources in the Irish government, saying that the Irish Army had concluded a in-depth mapping exercise of the border and the extent of the number of crossing points that existed, which were greater than what they previously alluded to?
I've been trying to follow as much as I can. I don't confess to having seen that. I can't confess I saw that report, I don't think.
It was headlines in the news. I thought you would have seen it.
I thought, Mr. Murray, were you nodding? Had you seen it? Or?
I have seen it, yes.
Oh, you have seen it, right. And they concluded, and we've also taken evidence from the Chief Constable, which seemed to reconcile with the number of crossings. They concluded there were about 285 crossing points. That's major roads, minor roads, approved crossings, unapproved crossings, laneways, fields, all sorts of crossing points. Mr. Henig, you'd said that you thought maybe it would be about 10 years before any technological solution had come about. And you then, I took a note of what you'd said, that if something did come about, which everyone's very vehemently working towards avoiding a hard border, but I'm struggling to get anyone to tell me what this hard border might look like. In fact, I'm not struggling. I haven't had anyone who can tell me. You'd use the words, something might be put in place. Has anybody said what that might be and where it would be if it were to come about?
Like I say, people have not been keen to speculate, but let us look at what happens on a border at the moment. First of all, let us look at the regulatory checks, the SPS, the animal and animal products checks. So you need to have border inspection posts. So somewhere in the environs of a border, you would have to have one or more places where animals and animal products can be tested.
Could just stop you there then. Is there any suggestion that there'll be 285 of them?
I have never no, because I've not seen anybody actually suggesting that. As I say, nobody has wanted to speculate. I'm merely I'm saying what happens at a border. I imagine.
I understand that. Yeah, but in other fields of activity, is there any suggestion in any, whether it's VAT or whether it's some sort of security checks, that there are going to be 285 installations. Has anyone that you've spoken to or read about suggested that that would happen? Because that to me sounds like what a hard border might be.
But I think
if there's ever going to be one.
If you would follow the precedent of Norway, Sweden, and of the Swiss border, which we heard earlier, you would be saying that what I assume that people would be looking to do would be to say that goods would not be allowed to cross on many of those 285. The problem, I mean, also you have problems. You actually have literally. I know there are farms that straddle the border, which is a problem point. Yeah, and these are questions that, frankly, both sides would have to try to address. I think you would try to put in my best guess is if, let us say, I hope this does not happen, let us say there were really relations just kind of broke down between the EU and the UK, I would guess that there would need to be posts somewhere in Ireland, and I don't know what the UK side would do either. Would we want to put checks in Northern Ireland? I think these are very difficult questions, and there is a very good reason that nobody wants to speculate on.
Yeah, but everybody, all the people that you've mentioned, have all said that they've no intention of doing that. The British government have said, will not do it. The Irish government have said, we will not do it. The European Union and the European Parliament and the European Commission have said they've no intention of doing it. So who's going to do this? Who's going to put these, whatever they are, as you say, something in place, whatever this is? So I'm really struggling to see what this mythical hard border would be. Nobody anywhere has ever explained to me what it would look like, how it would be put in place, how it would be monitored, and the most important of all, how would it be done in such a way that everybody in the Republic and in Northern Ireland could circumvent it at ease because of the fields, the lanes, the unapproved crossings? So what would be the point? If somebody emerged from the group who've all said they're not going to do it and said, well, we have to do it, is there an answer?
I think Dr. Tannam and Mr. Murray have some thoughts on this matter. Dr. Tannam.
2 points. I'm not a technological person, and I've never worked in IT, so I'm just not an expert. But I think the issue on the number of posts isn't really relevant. It's any in the context, again, of a post-conflict situation. And unfortunately, because we do have a minority of dissidents, that's the fear going forward, not immediately, but that it could become a target that could lead to a hardening then. So I don't think the number really matters. I think it's any. And then apart from that, yes, nobody wants it. The EU said no, it doesn't want a hard border, but the EU has also said that it must respect the integrity of the single market. So I think that's where that's why the backstop was introduced. It's why hopefully the future trading arrangement won't necessitate the backstop. But overall, yes, nobody wants a hard border, but everybody has been emphasising the contradictions that might be there.
You're saying the numbers not important, but if it appears to be the case that nobody seriously is suggesting that all 285 crossings are going to be manned, and you're saying the number's not important?
Not important, but that the risk is still there.
Right, okay. So then let us then take the discussion down the route of saying, well, what we'll do is we'll look at the sort of 10 or 12 main crossing points, main roads. Dundalk, Newry, Londonderry, Letterkenny, Auchnacloy. There's about 10 or 12 main roads.
As existed, if I can interject, before the single market came into place in 1993, a limited number of approved routes.
Okay. And that then leaves about 275 other ways to get across the border.
All of which, up to 1993, people were prosecuted on for moving cows.
Well, I've lived on the border for 65 years.
Smuggler.
And I haven't seen very much evidence of that in the past.
Did you have a licence to use a vehicle on an unapproved route?
No.
Because up until the 1970s, they were only issued to veterinarians, to doctors or to clergy crossing the border. There are plenty of documented cases of people desperately trying to get access to vehicular routes or vehicular use of non-approved routes that simply weren't granted up to that point. That is the history of life on the border.
There's been 100 years, more than double the lifetime of the EU and the EEC, where people have lived and worked and operated and socialised on either side of the border.
Yes.
Even when there was a terror campaign. Is anybody seriously suggesting now that some sort of token gesture, which I take it Dr. Tannam was alluding to, that the number isn't that important, that if just main roads were monitored, or whatever it is they're going to do, something put in place, in a small number of places, that's going to deal with people who are going to use the hundreds of other crossing points. And people who have a small bit of land on one side of the border and a large plant on the other side of the border, simply register both. And where would you like them to be from, the EU or outside of the EU? Doing what they've always done for 100 years, long before the EU came into existence. Is anybody suggesting to me now that WTO, the EU, British government, Irish government, somebody is going to devise a system that's going to say, well, we have to do this and this will deal with these problems?
I don't think anybody wants to go there. I should add that I'm on record in an article last week saying that actually what we need to do on these questions is to take this into a separate process and say, again, building trust. How are we going to actually manage these situations? That at the moment you have a situation where Brexit is almost seeming to hinge on this question, and to be honest, it's not a comfortable. I don't find this a very comfortable debate to start basically hinging the entire future of the UK's future relationship with the EU on these questions of border crossings or what border checks will put in place, because you start to say, well, who's going to blink? Is the EU going to put things in place? Is the UK going to put things in place? These are not comfortable questions, and I find it difficult. I find it difficult to say. What we can say is these are the things that the EU currently does with every external border. They put in place the border inspection posts. They put in place checks. Now, if you are saying they have to do something different, that's actually a big ask. Now, let's work that through. But let's not say, we're so special. They have to do something different. No, this has to be a collaborative process. It's the only way we could take this forward.
Chairman, hopefully nobody on the UK side is saying what you inferred they might be saying. But I think certainly what I'm indicating and have been indicating is that if everybody says they're not going to put infrastructure there, then somebody else has to say what it is they are going to put, because the British government have made it clear they're not going to do anything. Now, I'm going further and then saying, even if somebody did, there are so many ways around it, there is no point in doing it. It is totally and utterly irrelevant. People will circumvent it with ease, as they did for 100 years, and they will do it for the next 100 years. And unless Brussels wakens up to that fact, we're going to be in the bind that you've quite correctly alluded to. We do need to resolve this, but we need to resolve it on the premise that no infrastructure can be done, would be done, and if it were done, would be got around with ease. If we work on that premise, I think we're more likely to get a solution.
I have full sympathy, and that's why I outlined to you. I'm trying to be realistic about what could be a solution. What could be a solution in the timeline? You don't particularly like my timeline, but I'm trying to be realistic and say it could be done in that timeline. And here's ways in which you can do it. If things break down before, what's going to happen? Realistically, both sides are going to have to, before long, come back to the table and start talking again in that way, is my honest answer to you.
And there will be no hard border. That's
okay. Thank you. I should explain to the witnesses, although they're very experienced in these matters, that our job is to probe, so that ultimately our report is fair and balanced and even. So if it appears that some of the questioning is reasonably robust, I hope you'll forgive us. It really isn't, believe me, aimed at you, but more at the issue. Kate Hoey.
Thank you. Can I just
ask all of you, are any of you in receipt, not personally, but your department or your or where you work, in receipt of EU money?
We actually, in ESIP, it's one of the very few principles we have is that we don't.
So you've never been in...
I mean, I personally am not, and the organisation, I mean, I have no idea whether 15 years ago, but it is a very strong principle for the organisation.
Your university, where you're working, your
two
research?
Of my colleagues have just got Horizon 2020 research grants, one on radicalisation in the Balkans and one on ethics. She works in theology and ethics.
Thank you.
Ms. Owen, there isn't a research-intensive university in the United Kingdom that isn't in receipt.
No, I didn't ask that. I'm asking about your particular law university in Newcastle.
Newcastle most definitely is in receipt of European Union funding. I have not received any personally.
Well, I wouldn't expect you
European
personally
Union
to.
funding for my research.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Dr. Henig. Sorry. Not
doctor.
I've been
raised. I'm very pleased.
Well, after appearing in all these select committees, you never know what could happen. Can I just... I mean, you seem to have just plucked 10 years because it sounds a nice figure. Why not 9 years? Why not 7 years? Why 10 years?
Okay, let me just flesh out, because I can't put an exact...
Again.
I cannot put an exact number on it. What I would suggest is, and what I have suggested indeed, again in writing, is that what you need both sides to come together and actually produce a definitive report on all of these issues, and then to lay out a definitive and reasonable timetable in which they could be done. And that is actually what I would like to see personally within the political declaration. I've said here are ways I would improve the political declaration / withdrawal agreement, and that is one of them. And then you can have a better idea than my kind of gut feel guesstimate 10 years. I've discussed it with endless numbers of people online, and some people think 5 are more reasonable, some people think 20. My best guess, 10.
You obviously read a lot of articles. Did you happen to read a letter in the Belfast Newsletter this week by Lord MP, the former leader of the Northern Ireland Unionist Party, where he had talked about it being a sledgehammer to crack a nut in terms of the overall trade between the Republic of Ireland, most of it coming to Northern Ireland and Great Britain, and vice versa. And
I've heard the argument
in relation to the whole of the EU.
I know, I've heard the argument.
So it's a very small percentage point. I think it's 0.1% of the whole of the EU trade, and in this particular little bit of border, which my colleague has said how many crossings there are. So, I mean, do you not think we are actually getting to the stage where clearly some people want, perhaps, in the EU to make, or in the Irish government to make this more of an issue than it actually is?
From where I come from in trade, it's fully understandable that essentially precedent is really very important in trade relations and external trade relations. The EU has all these external borders, and while we can all say in this room we think that Northern Ireland is special and deserves a special case, the problem is that large numbers of other people will say we're special and we deserve special treatment as well. And I think that, no, I would take it as being the natural caution of customs officials. Customs officials are an extremely cautious bunch, because that is their job, to be an extremely cautious bunch. And this is the natural caution of bureaucrats and customs officials, not anything more sinister. That is my view.
Dr. Tannam, what's your view on what David Trimble, Lord Trimble, who was obviously instrumental in getting the Belfast Agreement implemented, his view and others on the way that the backstop, if implemented, was actually going to be piercing a knife really into the Belfast Agreement?
I actually haven't read his view on that, so that's a caveat. But I don't think it would. I can't see logically why it would pierce a hole into the Good Friday Agreement's institutions. It's a way of protecting the agreement, and that I think nearly is the whole point. So maybe if you want to explain in what way he thought it would pierce it.
Well, it's very simple. The people, if the backstop is implemented, the people of Northern Ireland will have no say in the relationship, the trading, and all of the extra things that will happen on trade, because it's going to be their representative will be the Irish government.
No, I think that's a big assumption. I don't think that would be the case.
Well, sorry, well then who will be speaking for people in Northern Ireland?
There are different
in the EU?
I think that, well, for a start, in general, it hasn't been laid out yet by the British government how the devolved regions specifically will be involved in all of this. But I think there will be, and there has already been mentioned, various committee systems.
But it's very clearly laid down in all the different structures of how it's going to work, the backstop, and there's no voice for Northern Ireland people.
I don't think the representation was hugely clear. My impression of the withdrawal agreement was that I couldn't see very clearly in all cases how exactly the devolved regions generally, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, how it would all work out. But I think there would be, I do not see at all any contradiction between the backstop, and I think that's a big assumption David Trimble has made, that would somehow
with respect, it's not
lose Northern Ireland's voice.
It's Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, backstop.
No, I think there would be provision for Northern Ireland to have a voice very much in that system.
How? Who?
The political parties. If the executive was running, obviously that would help. But
arrangement. The arrangement is oversight. That's the only thing it's offered. It's spelled out. I forget. I have paragraph 74. Can we leave that till we come to you?
I think you haven't read it.
Can I make a point on this?
Because of her particular, your particular expertise. That's why I came to you. And
well,
can I just ask?
It's not actually. Just to qualify that. I mean, there are many times as academics we may miss something, particularly at the moment. So I have really attempted to read all. I've tried to read all sides and be academic as I am. So my apologies for missing that.
I accept that, but I would say that Lord Trimble is not what you'd call an ordinary person in we're all, I suppose, extraordinary here.
I think both Mr. Murray and Mr. Henig.
Well, I want to ask Mr. Murray a separate question. I don't want to go into that one any further. I was asking you, Mr. Murray, did you happen to read? Have you heard of Professor Joseph Weiler? Was the head of the European Institute, now Monet Professor Blowan, and he wrote a very interesting article about having a front stop rather than a backstop. Would you have any comment on that?
Again, in terms of, well, I'll just take the issues through that you presented so far, Ms. Hoey, because I think in terms of Lord MP's letter, I think the sledgehammer to crack a nut metaphor is, well, it's truncating his quote because he says an incredibly politically sensitive nut within the letter. So putting it in those terms is perhaps to understate some of Lord MP's concerns around the arrangements. But also, it isn't a matter of cracking a nut, it's about maintaining relationships. It's about keeping in place the existing setup in which the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, operates, that background that's talked about in the preamble of the agreement, that it's based on a footing where the UK and the EU are cooperating within the European Union. You take that pillar out of the way and something has to be put in its place.
If the two sides want it to be like that, but if they want it to work, would you accept that it could continue to work more or less the same apart from some of the trade issues?
Forgive me, what could work more or less the same?
The good relationship that you're talking about.
The good relationship isn't kind words. It's an all-island energy market. It's at the moment a single unit for sanitary and phytosanitary measures. It's law. It's not good relationship. And if you're taking away law, it needs to be replaced with law if you're going to get to anything towards the UK government's stated goal of a frictionless border.
And you think that can't happen?
I think the withdrawal agreement makes a relatively good fist of achieving it between the sets of red lines that were put in place in advance. There's the Skilla and Sharbatus of the withdrawal agreement were the European Union Withdrawal Act and the Cross-Border Taxation Act. They set up an arrangement where Northern Ireland would not be a separate customs territory for the UK, but also set up that there would be no regulatory arrangement, or there would be no regulations that could be put in place to put in power to establish hard border infrastructure. The withdrawal agreement finds that way around the position that Parliament imposed upon the negotiations.
Okay, and just one final quick question, because one of my colleagues usually asks people, and I might as well get in first. How much time have you spent on the border, looking at all the different parts of the border in Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland?
I haven't been fortunate enough to visit
presume
recently.
you have,
Recently.
Yeah. Have you been lots of times and you know the border quite well?
Yes, but having grown up in Dublin, as an example of how things were, we used to go to Donegal on holidays, and we never went through Northern Ireland. We took nearly twice the length of time going through Sligo and to get there.
But
so
you never went to Northern Ireland?
Not as children, no, growing up. So since my PhD in the 90s, I have been.
Mr. Murray, have you?
My home was
A
in
lot of
sight
Irish people.
of the Republic of
You know
Ireland.
the border very well. Good. Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Henig, you wanted to make a point.
Thank you. I want to make a point on consultation because I think this is an important point, which is to say that I actually I would agree in one sense with the point that the consultation mechanisms within the withdrawal agreement are not sufficient, but I wanted to bring that into a general point, which is I have studied the withdrawal agreement in great detail, and generally the consultation mechanisms for the UK as a whole are pretty awful as well. So I wanted to say that this is not an isolated case for Northern Ireland. This is a case where the agreement is not, in my opinion, as good as it should be.
All right, thank you. Jim
And
Shannon.
simply in terms of Lord Trimble and the consent principle, there isn't a threat to the consent principle under the Belfast Agreement built into the withdrawal agreement. It doesn't separate Northern Ireland out as a customs territory, and the Supreme Court in the Miller case was absolutely clear in paragraph 135 that in terms of consent ran as far as the constitutional status of Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom.
Still doesn't answer the question of who's going to speak for Northern Ireland people if there's a backstop. But I'm sure some of my colleagues will take
And that isn't, that's a very good question, but it's not necessarily one that creates a legal argument.
I'm not really interested whether it creates a legal argument or not.
Lord Trimble is, and that's simply
works.
where your line of questioning started from.
All right, Dr. Tannam, quickly.
Back to Lord Trimble, and again, I'm sorry, I didn't read it. And it's not in any way a reflection of any preference on my part. But I think the Professor Michael Keating in Aberdeen, who may have, I don't know if he presented here, but he has argued just what David has said, that there are inadequate or unclear provisions really about any of the devolved regions having a voice in the withdrawal agreement. It's not clear, so that's one point. And then secondly, I know it's my hobby horse, but I think the British-Irish relationship is vital here as well in making sure Northern Ireland has a voice, in making sure there's legitimacy for the people of Northern Ireland and they feel there's legitimate representation. I think both governments would emphasise that. So it's not clear, but I don't think the backstop is going to put prickles or pin pricks in the Good Friday Agreement. I think that is an assumption.
Right.
So.
Thank you. Jim.
It's lovely to have you here, believe it or not. I want to ask you a couple of questions. But I'm very interested, Mr. Henig, in your opinion of how long it would take 10 years for it to happen. And then under a question to my friend and colleague here, Kate Hoy, you weren't sure it might take a shorter time. The reason why I asked the question is because it's simple to me. It reinforces my position. By the way, just for the record, I'm a BrExiteer, which is a very different opinion from the three of yourselves in this panel, I would suspect. And because of that, I see Europe as that bureaucratic monster that sucks all the money out of the United Kingdom. Why do you want another 10 years, or why will it take another 10 years? Not why you want take another 10 years. It's because that gives you another 10 years to get more money out of the United Kingdom. That's what I would suggest to you would be the real reason for it. It also perhaps maybe puts a question in my mind about and this has been very respectful to you, Mr. Henig, but if you told me if I had a job doing my farm and you told me it was going to take 10 years to do it, I'd tell you to go away and get somebody else to do it quicker. So honestly, with great respect to you, I'm sure that somebody in Europe can do it quicker in 10 years. It's all about will, it's all about trust. You also mentioned about, and I think all three of you have mentioned the issue about cross-border regulations and all the other things that take place. I have a company in my constituency, Lakeland Dairies. They have 2 factories in Northern Ireland, the 2 factories in the Republic of Ireland. The milk product comes across the border in a liquid form, it's turned into powder, it's changed back across the border again, it goes back across the border a third time, and it's then packed, produced and sent overseas. Tell me why that regulation and that system can't work whenever we leave the EU. Why should it not work? If the regulations in the Republic of Ireland are the same as the regulations in Northern Ireland for the 4 factories that Lakeland Dairies own, why should anything change? Anybody can answer that, please?
I will have a go at both parts of that.
Yeah.
Okay, on the point of, let's take your farm as an example. I don't know what you would want to do on your farm, but maybe you get a number of opinions. But are you necessarily, when I was working in IT, or when you were talking about procurement, you often said let's take away the one that's wildly the cheapest and one that's wildly the most expensive, and then let's look at where the middle ground is. I'm trying to give you a middle ground between people who say this can be done tomorrow and people who say this will never be done. And I'm trying to give you a middle ground. What I would suggest is, if you really want to build on that trust and to make a reasonable case for this, what we should be looking at is saying, right, both sides on the basis of trust, sit down, whatever both sides are, or get somebody neutral to do it, if there is somebody neutral, and say, how long is this realistically going to take with experts across the...
With great respect, it's not to do with my farm. It's to do with Lakeland Dairies, is a question I asked you for. Okay. I live in a farm. Okay?
No, but that was
I asked you a question. We asked a question, do you answer?
Yeah, and that was on the first part. I was about to answer the second part as well about the dairy
I would also just say to my colleagues, we do need to maintain normal courtesy when our witnesses are here as our guests, and we just need to keep that in mind.
I want to come on to the second part, which is whether or not you think that the EU is a terrible bureaucratic monster that wants our money, and I've been close enough to see the best and the worst sides of it, so I'm not going to comment. I think the important point is that it's the EU we're going to have to deal with in terms of the regulations, and it's the EU's regulations in terms of animal products crossing borders, which are a big problem here. And those are the EU's regulations. So what is it that we are saying?
The issue is this: the regulations in the Republic of Ireland for that company are the same as they are in Northern Ireland. Therefore, when the products change the border on both occasions, they go back and forth, nothing changes. It's going to be the same after we leave the EU. So why should anything change? Why should it change when the regulations are the same, when the products are the same, and their goals are the same?
So are there, and I think that's the question, I think Dr. Murray raised this before, are our regulations in fact going to stay the same? If they are going to stay the same, then I think that we have that strong case. At the moment, we don't know if they're going to stay the same. And I think that I've come back to, because it's very important that we come back to the idea of a US trade deal. In the case of a US trade deal, it is quite likely that some of our agricultural regulations will change. Now, that then introduces a problem. Now, do you want that to apply to Northern Ireland? So we recall that at the moment, the Northern Ireland is a single animal health zone. I can't remember the exact terminology. So I think there's big questions, and the big questions, for all of us to answer is how we would want that situation to be. Would we like a situation in which Great Britain changed regulations with regard to animals and Northern Ireland did not, in order to ensure that frictionless trade carried on? These are the kind of questions I think we just need to surface and say these are going to be the questions. Let's now look at it properly. I agree with you in theory that if we don't change our regulations, that should be the basis on which we can maintain frictionless trade.
Well, that's the point I'm trying to make, because if there's no willingness on our behalf to change any regulations from the agri-food sector or from others, then there shouldn't be the same obstacles or restrictions in relation to it. You mentioned also the issue about trust, and I'm going to ask you the previous question about trust, because it's very important. I think that we need to be trustful of each other, and this process has been rather divisive. I said earlier on in an intervention on my colleague here on the left-hand side that Donald Tusk's comments this week that Brexiteers were going to hell, just for the record, by the way, and for answer, I have a personal relationship with my Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ, and I know I'm not going to hell, and that's the only way you get to hell. You go to hell if you haven't got that personal relationship, and that's how it works. But he said that all Brexiteers were going to hell. Would you condemn that comment?
I thought it was ill-advised.
Yeah. Dr. Tannam, would your opinion be the same?
I don't think he meant it literally. It's not language I'd use.
That's right. That's right.
It's not within the EU competence.
But you would still condemn it, would you?
I thought it was ill-advised as well, but I don't.
Well, yeah, it was public letter. I mean, it was well seen what the issue was, but you would condemn it. Dr. Colin?
Yes, I would agree that it was singularly ill-advised, but it comes against a background of, shall I say, robust exchanges between the UK and the EU, going back to headlines like "Up yours to lowers" in the 1980s and 90s, and there is no excuse for escalating language, but I think it was seen as being a symbol of the frustration of the time, and no, I wouldn't condone it.
Donald Tusk's comments would be be condemned by you, is what you're saying. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And the reason why I asked the question is because it's all to do with how trust and how we can build relationships. Do you accept that the majority of people in the United Kingdom, Great Britain and Northern Ireland took a decision to leave the EU, and therefore that has to be honoured? Whoever wants to answer it. Or do you just ignore that referendum?
I'll have a go. I say that I take my view that it was, the referendum question said, do you want to leave? The referendum said, we leave. It didn't tell us about how we leave, but it was an instruction to leave. I take that fully. I just want to add another point, which is that I try to maintain a neutral commentary, and I've been accused of being a Remainer and a Leaver and a traitor by both sides, and I've even been accused of being a member of your party when I was arguing in favour of against the original backstop. So I wanted to just make that point.
If you haven't paid your money, you're not a member. The other issue really, there's been much talk.
Just to follow on, since you proffered the question to all of us, there is also 71% of the people of Northern Ireland signed up to the Belfast Agreement in 1998. And again, what's happening with Brexit is an effort to find a solution that respects that democratic exercise as well as the democratic exercise that took place in June of 2016. And the UK government has said the form that Brexit takes will be conditioned by the Belfast Agreement. Now again, like Mr. Henig, I'm trying to give you an academic commentary of this and not a political position. I'm not going to turn around and say to you that the Good Friday Agreement stops Brexit, because I can't make that point on my academic analysis. But it does condition Brexit if the UK government is going to say it remains bound by that international agreement, and it also has a democratic imprimatur through direct democracy in a referendum.
Do you accept that Sorry, Dr. Tannam.
No, I'm not British, obviously, so yes, I respect the decision made by the British electorate to leave, and I think the aim is just to manage it, and in the context of the Good Friday Agreement as well.
Well, it's very important to manage it in the right way. There's been much talk about and this is my last point, about the Malthouse alternative. I don't know if any of you have had an opportunity to look at that as a possibility of a way forward. If you have, what would your thoughts be on it?
Again, I feel like I've written articles on practically everything related to the border. I find that the foundations of it, in terms of what it says about a technology solution with regard to Ireland, unconvincing. But I also would like to draw attention to the fact that one of the documents that's sitting underneath the Malthouse, a document called A Better Deal, actually says there will need to be checks near the border for sanitary and phytosanitary, in other words, animal and animal origin products. So it, in fact, is quite odd that when you actually dig into it, it starts talking about checks at or near the border.
If the Malthouse alternative plan does look at a way forward, I think the real issue, and maybe the other two, whenever you respond, but maybe make some comment about that, it's quite clear that the majority of people in Northern Ireland, as the last national opinion poll in Northern Ireland indicated, want the backstop removed. It's quite clear in this Parliament that the backstop needs to be removed. But with two governments that have to come together in some way, do you accept, and I ask this in a kindly way, do you accept that if the majority of parliamentarians here don't want the backstop to go, and that's Parliament's opinion at this moment in time, and it hasn't changed, that the EU should try to make some solution and therefore look at how they can either time limit the backstop or remove it in its entirety? Your opinion?
I suppose firstly the backstop was included in the withdrawal agreement, so obviously we saw in the media there was concern and disappointment that then that appeared to be reneged on, so I think that's the first point. So it was included in the agreement that was signed or ratified by Theresa May. And then secondly, yes, the Parliament has voted in favour of dropping it. But the EU has also made it clear, having negotiated the withdrawal agreement with the British government, that it is not going to amend it in the withdrawal agreement, which to me, although I am also not a legal expert, that makes sense in terms of the fact the agreement had been negotiated and had been signed off, and in terms of the issue and the sensitivity and the problem of the border, which we've all been talking about today.
The Maltese Compromise is essentially, in many regards, a rebranding of maximum facilitation. And we can look at its pros and cons by comparison to the withdrawal agreement and the backstop. It's about deep regulatory alignment. And those two things are not the same thing, and they will not achieve the same thing. Customs facilitation, as opposed to regulatory facilitation, or as opposed to a deep regulatory arrangement, take you to very different places. And when we're talking about Strand 2 of the Belfast Agreement and all of the North-South bodies, they rely on deep regulatory alignment. Now, that's not my position, that's the UK government saying repeatedly, we're following the letter and the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement. In fact, Dominic Raab, having left the UK government, maintained that position before you just a couple of weeks ago in this committee, the letter and the spirit. If you're going to say there's that commitment, well, then that has to take account of how North-South bodies work. You will expect your opposite partner in a negotiation to want to cash in that commitment. The UK has made that commitment. The EU is simply saying, put your money where your mouth is in negotiating terms. How can you come up with something that secures the same arrangements as the withdrawal agreement, the same benefits that the withdrawal agreement does, and Maltese doesn't do it? It is not a deep regulatory alignment.
Just one final comment to yourself, Dr. Tannam. You referred to the withdrawal agreement that the Prime Minister negotiated with the EU. It didn't and was not endorsed by the House of Commons and by the this House of Parliament. So that's where the real say lies, and that's why we expressed through this House extreme disappointment about the withdrawal agreement, the retention of the backstop, which constitutionally changes the position of Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and we have deep concerns over that. Those are the facts of life for us as parliamentarians, and also as a representative for Northern Ireland and the people that we represent.
But just, I suppose, just to make clear, though, that obviously, for obvious reasons, not everyone is represented in Parliament from Northern Ireland, so that's the issue too, which gets into a whole other debate. But the fact is,
the reason they're not here, the reason they're not here is their choice.
Oh, I know that.
So that's their choice. They're not here. They can't represent their people. That's their problem. The people who are here represent the people. That's how it works.
Maria Colin.
Thank you. I just wanted to go back on a couple of things. Mr. Henig, you said that in the Better Deal document that it says that there needs to be checks near the border. Whereabouts in the document does it say that?
From recollection, it is Article 63.
Okay, well, Article 63 actually says for photosanitary checks that checks should be done on the premises of the exporter or the importer. So it doesn't actually say at the border.
It doesn't say or near the border. It may not be the exact article, but there is a clear reference. I have been through the document. There is a clear reference about checks may be done at the border.
Okay, so
near the border. I don't think it actually says at the border. I think.
So that wasn't. You clarify that's not actually what it says in the document.
Well, I would need to check the exact. There is a reference to checks near the border.
Okay. So when we had evidence from Lars Carlson and Hans Meissen, they both not only are they experts in the field, this is what they do for a job, and they are customs experts around the world. They both gave an example of where in Rotterdam there are checks done 20 kilometres from the port. And they are not talking about introducing new technology or new systems. These are systems in place. They both agreed with you that this takes time to introduce these systems, and commented that HMRC have not even started the process of that. Can you understand why HMRC would not have started looking at these systems months ago?
I can't comment on. I've not been involved with HMRC. I don't know what they are looking at. I think that What I will say is that Hans Meis and Lars Carlson are not considered by many in the customs expert community to be representative of the customs expert community.
Even though they're doing this for a living on a day-to-day basis?
I'm being very careful in what I say. Whether or not they're doing it on a living, they are not considered by many in the customs field to be representative. There is a lot of scepticism about the evidence that they are providing and the solutions that they are suggesting. So on that basis, I could understand why people are being cautious, but my own view, just to repeat it again, is that we should be saying there will be an expert report bringing in these and others and actually saying what can be done, what cannot be done. That is, we have not seen that. It would be a very detailed and very good piece of work for somebody to do, and then you have, everybody has a common ground, a common basis on which to proceed on this question.
Okay, and Dr. Tannam, I mean, your paper that the work you're doing at the moment is looking at British-Irish relations, and I think I probably agree with you that there's the trust issue has somewhat broken down. So do you agree that whether it was the burn in hell comment or turning up with a big thank you card to a press conference has not been helpful in building that trust in that British-Irish relationship?
Well, the burn in hell comment wasn't from the Irish government, obviously. No. The thank you card, I didn't actually think about it. I saw a picture of it. I didn't think that was particularly detrimental. I think both governments actually have managed the situation relatively well. I honestly think that it's had some low points, but I think both governments are bargaining with each other, and there's always strategic aspects to that. But I really think within the constraints of what's been happening, language has been quite measured, and there has been sympathy, as I said, both from Theresa May to the Irish government and from Simon Coveney and Louis Varadkar to the British government and Theresa May. So I think it's been relatively measured over time.
So do you think the relationship has deteriorated since Enda Kenny left? Because when he was Taoiseach, there was a very much more positive relationship. They, he very much wanted the same things as Leo Varadkar, but his approach to the negotiations had a different tone.
No, I don't. I mean, I've heard that said before. I think initially there have been ups and downs, and Charlie O'Flanagan, who was minister under Kenny, had some hardline rhetoric as well at times. And really, I think what occurred was that the British government has so much on its policy-making agenda that I think there was concern, I assume, looking at it from the sidelines, that Northern Ireland needed to be focused on, because for a long time, even in the Brexit referendum campaign, Northern Ireland wasn't an issue. So I think at times where there are these apparent escalations, whether it's initially in the Enda Kenny government or after, it's to do with really trying to get focus on Northern Ireland and trying to make sure the British government does engage about Northern Ireland. But I don't think there's any difference underlying that between Enda Kenny and Leo Varadkar.
Okay, and so Colin Murray, do you think there is a political agenda on Irish domestic issues that's underpinning why the kind of breakdown in trust between the British government and the Irish government? Do you think there is an underlying political motive that's apart from Brexit?
Well, Dominic Raab came before you a couple of weeks ago and said that he wouldn't impugn the intentions of anyone within the negotiating process, and I'm not in the room, and I'm certainly not there to do that either. If the Irish government was being brutal about its position on the negotiations, it has no basis with its constituents of trying to secure jobs in Belfast. It doesn't gain from that scenario or giving Northern Ireland competitive advantages against the Republic of Ireland. I don't think what it's doing is out of altruism. I think what it is doing is out of its role as a co-guarantor of the Belfast Agreement 1998. I think I would certainly be of the opinion that that is motivating its actions in this.
So with some of the scare stories, and we heard some this morning over the blood products, and as someone who works as a nurse in a cancer specialty, to even suggest that blood products in the UK are not safe, I think is highly irresponsible. But give that aside, we have heard some...
Ms Caulfield, I made absolutely no such suggestion. I said that in the future, when we come to regulatory divergence, that there needs to be checks. those checks will have to be done on
Absolutely.
products like blood for exactly the reason you say about their importance.
I don't disagree that there'll have to be checks, but to say that that's because UK blood products have a history of being unsafe, I think is slightly irresponsible. But anyway, there have been other fear stories.
We regulate
going
because we learn from mistakes.
Yeah,
that's where regulation builds up.
And in terms of having a hard border, this term hard border, where I know you come from Southern Ireland. How many times?
I don't come from the Republic of Ireland.
Okay, so how many times in your experience, in how many times has there actually been a physically hard border post the Good Friday Agreement? And given that there's a VAT border there, a currency border and a security border.
So at the moment, for all private purposes, the border is invisible. That is how it exists at the moment, but that isn't a function of the Belfast Agreement. It's a function of what the Belfast Agreement is based upon. And the preamble to the Belfast Agreement says that this is all about a history and a build-up of cooperation between Ireland and the United Kingdom. And if you want the two pillars that the Belfast Agreement are based on, one is the common travel area and the two legal pillars, and the other is the single market, which was completed in 1993, allowing customs infrastructure to be removed at that date. So not simply within living memory, within relatively recent memory, there was a customs border simply because the customs union and the single market were not completed as entities.
And so do you think the common travel area is under threat then with Brexit?
The common travel area is in many ways written in sand. There is no agreement, public treaty that underpins it. So we are in a scenario where a lot of people are expected to take on trust that laws will not change on the future.
Even though that's going through the immigration bill that's currently going through
And
Parliament.
that's simply one aspect of it. That's entry into the United Kingdom. So beyond that, there's status within the United Kingdom, what people can do, and that's in any amount of legislation. It's in the Representation of the People Act 1983 that allow people to vote. It's in the Juries Act that allow Irish citizens to sit in UK juries. There's a lot of legislation, but there's not an international agreement that underpins it. So I think what people might be concerned about is that Parliament in the future, and I'm certainly not imputing this of any MP in this room or their intentions, but there could be divergence or move away from that.
So even though the government is actually putting legislation through Parliament as we speak to underpin and to safeguard the common travel area?
On one specific aspect of the common travel area, and in many regards it's actually to correct a problem with it. When the Immigration Act of 1971 was enacted, the common travel area was thought mainly to be about movement from Ireland into the UK. It predated international air travel, and so it doesn't create in law, a clear legal right for an Irish citizen, say, flying from Dubai into the United Kingdom at Heathrow to then maybe spend a couple of days in the UK and then make a flight to Dublin. It doesn't create a setup for that person coming from outside the common travel area to come in. The immigration bill is a really useful piece of legislation in, again, what Dr. Tannam is saying, trying to de-escalate rhetoric, trying to make this more responsible, trying to say we're going to... It's a goodwill gesture to fix this.
The UK government acknowledges that there is a gap in the current common travel area legislation and is actually bridging that gap and supporting and upholding the common travel area. What may happen in the future, none of us can predict, but at the moment the actions of the UK government are to underpin and to safeguard that common travel area.
And the actions of the UK government in putting in place the withdrawal agreement were also to safeguard the Good Friday Agreement. As I say, the 1998 arrangements rest on two legal pillars, and the common travel area is just one of them. But I would acknowledge the UK government is taking steps to show a lot of willingness to protect that. And I expect, in talking to sources within government in the UK and in Ireland, that there will be more coming out of that. There has already been moved towards more bilateral treaties.
Okay, so
but what I would say is The withdrawal agreement sets that up. Article 5 of it allows that, and it's not part of EU competence.
Okay, so do you not agree that when you wrote your article 5 months ago in the UK Constitution Law Association that that there will be identity checks at the border potentially post-Brexit, that was probably an irresponsible thing to do and doesn't reflect the actions of the UK government in trying to underpin and safeguard the common travel area?
Again, that's not what I wrote. I wrote that that had been a function of life under the common travel area previously, that there was nothing in law to prevent that.
You said it could happen in the future.
And again, I do not have a crystal ball. I did not know the immigration bill was in train at that point. There were no moves to make new treaties to firm up the common travel area arrangements. I'm acknowledging before you today that those moves are now being made and that they are very important, but we are very late in the day.
Okay, thank you.
We're aware, of course, that there are checks already carried out on people travelling between the two jurisdictions, but they tend to be evidence-based and based upon intelligence received.
Yes. Yeah. And in fact, in the latest legislation, they were once again strengthened to give the PSNI, as the Chief Constable came before you recently to explain, a range of further powers in that regard.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Tannam,
so
do you
just
want
very briefly, I think what's coming into my mind from speaking to the committee is an underlying difference about whether we need to legalise things for the future, for the unknown future. It's like making a will where you write everything in because you don't know how things will progress. So in my case, my son is disabled, so we're setting up a trust and there's so many issues around and foreseeing that. And I think that's the analogy. So at the moment, regulation is the same. We would hope it will be. We all believe in health and safety standards, but we don't know the future, and we hope it won't be bad. We hope these things won't happen. But I think what you're getting at is that we have to protect against an unknown future that could be negative, even if the risk is low.
Right, thank you. Lady Herman.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. It's been a very, very interesting morning. Very lively committee, but also very, very good witnesses, if I may say so. Can I just jump from a series of issues? I'll carry on from the common travel area. The common travel area, of course, only applies to British and Irish citizens. The Republic of Ireland will remain within the EU, and therefore citizens of other EU member states will be perfectly entitled to come and work in the Republic of Ireland. So while the common travel area, and it's going to be put into legislative form in some aspects in the immigration bill, what happens to the other EU nationals who cannot benefit from the common travel area? How does the UK monitor? Because that's what they want to do. They want to take back control of the borders. How are they going to do that post-Brexit?
Sorry, I haven't looked at all you much. None of us seem to be experts in this.
Colin, yes.
There has been a strengthening of the powers accorded to the Chief Constable of Northern Ireland at the moment. There's been a commitment to the PSNI to approach it in terms of, as Dr. Morrison points out, to follow leads and to look at checks beyond borders. The Gardaí have been doing that now for some time on buses or in vehicles crossing the border. I would suspect that on the A1 that will become a fact of life at some point presently, that there will be checks on buses passing from Dublin to Belfast. There is also now provision in legislation for checks at train stations across the border too.
And what would happen if, in fact, these were French or German citizens who were coming into Northern Ireland, but they were working in the Republic of Ireland?
So very much then depends on the terms of the withdrawal agreement and whether it goes through. If there is no deal and they are third country nationals, yes, then we get into the territory where that would be an illegal entry into the United Kingdom.
And the responsibility moves to the PSNI to deal with it. It's a very unfortunate situation for the PSNI to find themselves in. What about smuggling? Mr. Henig, you mentioned at the beginning, you made some reference and you were asked about smuggling. I mean, what do you expect in terms of an escalation or, in fact, wistfully thinking here, a reduction in smuggling? What would your prediction be on your extensive experience and expertise in this area. Post-Brexit, what do you expect to see?
I'm not an expert in smuggling, I should say.
No, in combating and dealing with customs duties. No, it was your expertise in dealing with customs, but not in smuggling, obviously. But very witty.
It's actually very difficult. I mean, there is already smuggling. Yes. What are we talking about? Are we talking about individuals or business? And I think that what we're really talking about here is the sort of is business issues. You know, it's essentially trying to pass off something that's come into the UK at a low tariff. Sorry. Okay.
Forgive me for interrupting. We're actually talking about organised crime. We're talking about the imminent organised criminal gangsters that we have far too many of in Northern Ireland, who must see this as a potential for a very lucrative business. I think that's the issue I'd like you to address.
And I think that in the event that, for example, that there is no deal and the UK, for example, got rid of all tariffs and there were still tariffs in the EU, then you are looking at that being potentially quite a serious issue, because that becomes quite a lucrative opportunity. Yep. So I think a lot will depend on what the UK chooses to do in a no-deal situation. I assume we're more talking about a no-deal situation than a deal situation. In a deal situation where actually everything is still aligned, in thinking about the withdrawal agreement as it is at the moment, then I don't see why that makes a big difference. But in a no-deal situation, if the UK decides to suddenly start changing lots of regulations or to start changing the customs duties that we are charging and to be, for example, below those of the EU, that clearly creates a much greater opportunity for organised crime. I will call it organised crime because that's what it is. So yes, there is that clear concern.
Yes, Colin, do you want to add?
No, it would be very much to back up that concern that smuggling thrives in any circumstances where there are regulatory divergences or cost divergences. If it becomes lucrative to do it, and there is definitely a criminal infrastructure in place to allow it to happen, the bigger those divergences, the more lucrative moving goods furtively across the border will become.
Yes, so yet another responsibility for the PSNI.
Or for customs officials who are being vigorously recruited.
Vigorously recruited and tasked with specific duties in Northern Ireland.
Well, again, this is the issue of the recent newspaper headlines as to how many customs officials need to be recruited and whether those targets are being met.
Yes, we have some.
But yes, HMRC is part of the joint task force set up under Fresh Start. Yes. It is already about getting the Gardaí, customs authorities in the Republic, customs authorities in the UK to spot attempts to get round excise duties. So yes, those teams are already at work in Northern Ireland.
Yes, but are recruiting additional personnel.
Well, that very much is where the newspaper reports are leading us to believe.
Yes. Dr. Tannam, can I just ask you, I was very struck by something you said in relation to the common interest and overall diplomacy between the British and Irish governments, and you felt that in fact it had been used very well. With which I agree, actually. But you also made the point that going forward we should have more robust use of the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, in the continued absence of a functioning assembly for over 2 years, I mean, do you see any evidence of any will at all to make more robust use of the institutions of the Good Friday, the Belfast Agreement, amongst political parties, indeed, in Northern Ireland?
At the moment, no. I mean, I think, I have heard Lord Trimble, saying that this can't be resolved really until after the BrExit negotiations are resolved, so that the executive really won't be in place until this period has been solved. So I think that is a big factor and a big impediment to more robust use of the institutions, and to, again, back to legitimacy and Northern Irish people having a voice. I think that's a huge problem. I still would emphasise British and Irish governments in keeping their eye on the ball in trying to incentivise cooperation. If we look at the peace process, it was very much British and Irish governments that created incentives and had a carrot and stick strategy to encourage and to really I suppose, reach the conclusion of the Good Friday Agreement. So I think if there's dedication coming at that level, at elite level, and at prime ministerial level, because that really has been absent, particularly on the British side, even in the peace process after really the St Andrews Agreement, the Irish government also sort of was not taking its eye off the ball, but less involved because there was peace, because everything seemed fine. So I think it can be done. I think it is a huge problem about the executive not being in place, but I think that the British-Irish dimension to that is essential, and that was the whole underpinning of the Good Friday Agreement as well. The Strand 3 East-West dimension wasn't just a package deal. I think it was very central to creating incentives within Northern Ireland for cooperation at a higher level, at elite level, from both governments.
Yes, and how detrimental do you feel it has been during the 2 years of Brexit negotiations that we have not had a functioning assembly in which the SDLP, they lost their seats in this House in the general election of 2017, but other smaller parties, indeed Sinn Féin, who don't take the seats in this House, that their voices have not been heard at Stormont. How detrimental has that been?
I think it's very detrimental, and as Mr Paisley said, it's Sinn Féin's choice not to take their seats, but overall the situation is very detrimental, that there isn't an executive in place to have a coherent voice. I think it's hugely detrimental, and that the level of cooperation, even if it was in place, I suppose there would still be a risk that Brexit would become this sectarianised, or not sectarianised, but divisive issue that could impede that voice. So I think it is very detrimental, yes.
Yes, and could I just ask Colin then, just following on from what you said, I mean, how has Brexit impacted on identity in Northern Ireland?
Well, I think if I can bring it back to this idea of the letter and the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement, when David Trimble gave his Nobel Prize acceptance speech and he talked about Northern Ireland prior to the agreement as having been a cold house for Catholics, there was definitely something in the rhetoric around the agreement that set up an offer that Northern Ireland would be a space that was in many ways like Ireland. You would have north-south healthcare or environmental or agricultural cooperation over the border to, if you like, take the sting out of the issue of nationalism, to try to put an offer in place that says, stay within the United Kingdom. Look, you can have the best of both worlds. Northern Ireland is a special constitutional space where this cross-border cooperation works. But that was built on, and it is shown in the mapping exercise that both the UK and the EU government did going into the withdrawal agreement, that those elements of Strand 2 are based upon EU-designed cooperation and EU measures.
Yes.
And that's, if you like, where identity is knocked out of kilter. If those foundations are removed, then a profound part of the offer that was made in 1998 begins to erode. Northern Ireland begins to feel like somewhere that has been moved on its centre of gravity. The withdrawal agreement is an effort at stasis in its core, to keeping Northern Ireland in important ways where it is at the moment, be it on, and it's not just on trade, it's on non-discrimination law, and it's on right, safeguards and equality of opportunities. All of that is built into the withdrawal agreement. If we just talk about it in terms of trade, and if we just talk about it in terms of customs, we get into what Tom Paulin described as a fictionary universe, where the laws are not the same as the ones in this place where we call real. We miss a really key point about what those arrangements are and how they were set up. And that's why this has become more and more an orange and a green issue, why this has become an issue that is so divisive. And the Belfast Agreement is supposed to be an agreement that, well, we've talked about, certainly you have in previous sessions of this, an agreement that lasts in perpetuity, or that comes to an end when circumstances are met, a vote on a border poll that would bring alignment. But even then, there would be protections for the birthright of people who would call themselves unionists to still describe themselves as British and claim a UK passport, even if sometime in the future Northern Ireland joined the Republic of Ireland to become a united country. The Good Friday Agreement would not end at that point, and there is no stop on its operations. But, if you like, you can't have it the other way either. You can't erode a lot of things that people who are Irish citizens in Northern Ireland regard as being core to their identity without risking that whole edifice.
But is there a feeling that, in fact, that their identity is being eroded in the way Brexit negotiations have taken place?
Comes to Henig and the idea if you take away one part of my identity, you take away part of me. And I think if we look at the way EU citizenship rights have changed, from the joint report in 2017 through to the withdrawal agreement, Northern Ireland is now very much seen as being an external to the European Union. So your European Union citizenship rights still exist as an Irish citizen, but they would exist in the same way as if you were in Canada. It only is through the withdrawal agreement and its hardwiring in of, say, EU counter-discrimination law that there is more of a move towards that trying to maintain the rights, safeguards and equalities of opportunity part of the agreement. It's not as in a whole, you will get to retain your EU citizenship and everything that means today after March 29th,
yes,
even in the withdrawal agreement.
And if you follow that argument through, does that bring a border poll, you've mentioned it earlier, that bit closer if people are feeling that their identity has been undermined by the Brexit negotiations?
I think that
the impact of Brexit
is the question that is above my pay grade. It would be speculation on my part to go there, and I'm not going to do that to this committee.
Dr. Tannam, yes, please.
I think back to the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement and the letter, the principle of consent is hugely important, and I think a border poll would not be advisable, because that really, as we know from referenda, becomes a very black and white issue. So I would argue, and I think it would be the Irish government's position, not to prioritise a border poll.
No, well, it's not for the Irish government to prioritise a border poll.
No, but I mean, in
Absolutely
terms
not.
of, there has been talk, though, of, are there being plans made on scenarios for unification? And I think that the Irish government would be very against that, is my belief, from what I can gather, because it would be seen as destabilising and against the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement, where there's recognition of two identities and of the need for consent, which doesn't just mean, at least my interpretation is, that 51%, for example, would not be a very consensual outcome for Irish unification. So as regards a border poll, people are saying it could be more likely. I know some American senators have also said it. Obviously, we see why, but it's not on the agenda, and it definitely wouldn't be something that would be prioritised. Even Sinn Féin has gone to and fro about this, so I think it's not. I'm sort of hedging my bets, so it could be more likely, but there isn't a political motivation. And the Irish government is important there, even if officially it's not got the role.
Well, the power to call a border poll lies with the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I know, but in terms of the
planning,
etc., it's still important, and it's not doing so.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's worth pointing out that Sinn Féin on the Radio 4 this morning was certainly not indulging in any to-ing and froing on this particular matter.
Maybe they went one way, throwing.
Indeed. John Grogan.
Yes, I've just two brief questions to Mr. Henig, and then just one general question, but just a very brief preamble. I must say I found the evidence as robust and as compelling as the questioning, and I suspect who knows how long max fact solutions would take. I tend to think it'd be nearer 10 years than 2, but all I am sure of is it took 80 years to get peace on the island of Ireland, and I coming from a different point of some of the committee, I would like Parliament to have votes on other options. But if we do, or if we don't, and if we do, the evidence today has reinforced in my mind that if we get down to no deal or the Prime Minister's deal, I'd have to vote for her deal, really, if it got to that point. Not just because of the impact on the economy of the Keighley constituency I represent, but because I just could not risk soldiers from Keighley having to go back to Northern Ireland as they did for many, many years. And so I think I found the evidence very compelling. But just a couple of questions. You mentioned at the beginning, you did technology, and you said trust, and you said processes as well, that you'd have to, if you were going to get a solution where you didn't need borders, you'd have to look at processes. Just to be clear in my mind, what sort of processes are we talking about? Maybe it's obvious, but yeah.
Okay, so this is when you're putting in place technology. What is the technology actually doing? What is it there for? So it is there to say, right, a trader has their goods. They are trading them into Ireland. What steps do they need to go through? And you run through those steps in turn. Right? How can technology help each of their steps? What happens if those steps are not? They do not go through them for one reason or another? What if they are illegal traders? And you are running through each of those sort of process steps in turn and saying, right, where can technology play a part? What happens if something breaks down? Do we need some trust here? Do we need some law in this place? So what you really have to do is map out all of the different potential scenarios for all of the different regulations, and that's the process part. Okay, so then where does the technology fit into all of those different flows?
I see. And you made an interesting point, or I think perhaps one of the witnesses made an interesting point. If you did get into the backstop, isn't it true that Northern Ireland would have many, many competitive advantages in the circumstances of the backstop? If the backstop lasted 10 years while we're working out the technology and other things, there's potential for boom time in Northern Ireland, in that they would have have a competitive advantage over the Republic in terms of one of the main customers, England, Scotland, and Wales, and yet they'd have a back way into the European single market. It would be boom time, wouldn't it? If I was a big American investor, I'd be thinking, well, let this not last 10 years, but 50 years.
It's an interesting point of view, and I've heard it said quite a bit by a number of people that actually Northern Ireland could get the best of all worlds and could economically really benefit from this.
Yes.
I am slightly unconvinced. Right. I can see the argument.
Yes.
I'm just unconvinced on in terms of the uncertainty factor of it, and whether everything would actually stay in place. If you knew that was going to be the case and you had a long-term advantage, clearly that is something that would be looked at by inward investors. But if there's some uncertainty there, you'd be saying, well, is there some uncertainty? Wouldn't it be better to do something slightly different? But there is no question that there are business groups in Northern Ireland who have said, we should be taking advantage of this, we should be shaping it in a way we benefit from, and perhaps that's not the argument that we've heard to date.
And it is important to look at the limits to the withdrawal agreement. It keeps Northern Ireland, essentially, if you look at Articles 6 through 9, in the single market for goods. So that will affect certain businesses, it will not affect other businesses.
I was going to emphasise in all this the sectors involved, so different sectors that lose and win.
Yeah, I see. I think I might start a campaign for Yorkshire to join the backstop and for it to be 50 years. But a more general question to you all. In terms of, I attended on behalf of a committee an interesting committee meeting which was led in the House of Lords, and it was an attempt of the different parliaments to have some oversight of the process, and it had many limitations and so on. And you've said that, I think you've all referred to the fact that it's not really quite clear what influence, if we do the deal and then we go to the withdrawal agreement and so on, it's not quite clear what role the different parliaments and assemblies should have. If you were writing a piece of paper as to what the arrangements should be, what would be the suggestions you would make?
If I take the slightly flippant point first of Yorkshire joining the backstop, essentially that takes you into Norway plus territory. Indeed. So certainly some, and I know that they've now left, the DUP committee members are intensely concerned about the idea of division springing up in the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and Great Britain on the basis of the special arrangements that are put in place, the deeper protections that are there for goods in Northern Ireland, and how that would affect particularly West-East trade. If the entire of the UK exited into the EEA, it would deal with those concerns. And it is not to suggest that as the fix, because it would be a Norway Plus solution. A lot of the checks that are at the Norway border at the moment are on livestock, and Norway isn't, say, in the Common Agricultural Policy, and there are checks in that area. So there could be, say, bolt-ons, like keeping the All-Ireland SPS measures arrangement to create that sort of setup. But beyond that, you would have a whole UK approach rather than the Backstops approach. What I will say is that the Backstops approach is a function of Parliament's red lines as laid out in the Withdrawal Act and the Cross-Border Taxation Act.
I think for Northern Ireland, assuming the executive is in place, I think there would have to be, apart from the whatever devolution arrangements are reached, there would have to be a connection and clear connection with the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement. So what comes to mind would be the British-Irish Council, which hasn't really been utilised very fully, but it represents the Crown dependencies. Scott, well, you all know this, I'm sure. So I think that would be an avenue where you would have the connections made between Northern Ireland's voice and the Good Friday Agreement and the devolved institutions through the Good Friday Agreement would be what comes to mind. So I think there would have to be that connection, assuming the executive's in place, which I hope it will be.
Just to add to that, and not wanting to introduce more division, but as somebody from Lancashire, I just want to put that on the record. That I think that what I was saying about the inadequate consultation is in the respect of the transition period and then the backstop, the way that the UK is going to be subject to all manner of things, and there is no expectation that anybody from the UK is going to attend any of the meetings in Brussels that are attended at the moment where these laws are set. Sure. Now, I would have made a much bigger point about making sure that you could have attendance, and then I think so. There's a question of treaty in terms of UK's rights to be there, and then I think there is a question of UK internal politics and procedure to say, right, if the UK was to have consultation rights, how do we bring into play the devolved assemblies and others with an interest? And that is something which, again, I don't think we have fully gone into detail on. I think it will be something we need to look at quite urgently after, on the assumption of leaving with a deal. We need to look urgently at how is the UK going to contribute, what underlying bodies are going to make sure the UK position has the support of widespread support of devolved assemblies and others.
Thank you, Chair.
To what extent do you think the Republic of Ireland would welcome such a thing? Because one of the things that the Republic of Ireland is, of course, concerned about is that it's somewhat unique position with respect to corporation tax may look even more unique on departure of the United Kingdom from the European Union. It have very few friends in supporting its position, and we know that Brussels is looking rather enviously at its current stance in relation to taxation, and there is pressure, mounting pressure, to deal with it in some way, which would clearly not be in the interest of the Republic of Ireland, particularly if the UK outside the European Union decided to adjust its own corporation tax rates. That might make Belfast look very attractive indeed, as we've touched on previously. So to what extent do you feel Dublin is likely to wish to encourage representation outside of the European Union by the UK in Brussels after Brexit?
Well, you touch on a really interesting and politically sensitive issue within Brussels, which is the more if Dublin wished to do that and to wish to maintain UK influence, there would be a number of other countries that say, hang on a minute, we definitely don't want that, because what you've just said is that if the UK has continuing influence in Brussels, it may be able to help Ireland do something that is unpopular with other member states. You start to see why other member states, we are led to believe, led by France, did not want the UK to be present at these meetings for fear that we would be able to exert more influence than a non-member should have by being in the room. This is one that is going to rumble on, and I think that I think we would want to be clear. I think we would want to start small and more modestly than that, of saying we would like to be part of the technical committees, and not suggest that the reason we wish to be in the rooms of Brussels is so that we could make representations and try and control things from outside. I don't think that would go down very well.
Sure.
I don't think the Irish government would support that either. I think it would be very against that, just because of the emphasis they've had so far on maintaining the sort of being part of the EU family, so to speak. So there'd be big wariness and opposition.
And I suppose on a technical issue of the corporation tax rates in the Republic of Ireland in the Lisbon Treaty got very clear commitments from the EU with regard to retaining its tax status, and that would be outside EU competences to change it, certainly to change it against Ireland's will. So it's perhaps not the circumstances. Again, out with a major treaty revision that was accepted by Ireland in the future where UK influence could ever be brought to bear.
Very good, thank you. Nigel Mills.
Just a couple of questions. Although, speaking as somebody who represents a seat in a county that borders Yorkshire, I'm not sure the customs processes in the Backstop would be very popular on the M1 when you have to have a paper customs declaration for every truckload. So maybe, John, you want to think carefully how long the queues would be. But just a couple of questions. First, when we talk about hard border, are we all talking about infrastructure and fences and stuff out the border? We're not talking about other things, or do you have different definitions in mind?
I try not to use the phrase hard border. I've tried to use the phrase border infrastructure because I think that's a more helpful definition. So that's how I've been defining it.
Physical infrastructure is the term used in a lot of government statements.
But again, if we move... There was a rather flippant story last week about roaming charges returning as soon as the EU, as Ireland leaves the EU, and how that's going to affect, as soon as the UK leaves the EU, and how that's going to affect holidaymakers. And I suppose at the border in Ireland, that's not a holidaymaker issue. That's a day-to-day lived reality of your phone will keep flipping between different providers, and it's everything that changes the arrangements at the moment and makes life more difficult. You could characterise as a hardening, long before we ever get to concrete blocks and helicopter gunships.
Okay, it's just the withdrawal agreement does refer to a hard border, but then unhelpfully doesn't define it. But you certainly see two of you at least to be thinking that a hard border means infrastructure.
You've never seen an armed link?
Can I just qualify that? I agree. Sorry. I agree with the holistic definition, particularly in the context of Northern Ireland and the peace process and cultural and work links and all of that. In terms of the security risk, there's been a focus on the physical side because of dissidents targeting that, if there's physical infrastructure, but it is a broader concept.
Okay. Now, Mr. Henig, you're not a big fan of this agreement, I think, looking through some of your Twitter posts about it. I think probably the most generous you've been was referring to the Prime Minister appears to be proposing blackmailing Parliament to support her bad deal at the last minute because no deal would be even worse. I think that was about just before this committee session started. So we can conclude you're not a supporter of the deal. Is that fair?
It is fair to say that having read the agreement, I was disappointed with large parts of it, and I felt that although you understand the deal, and I want to just be clear about this, you understand the deal as being a landing zone between the red lines that both parties set, and those red lines included, with regard to the border in Ireland, that it is also the job of negotiators to make sure that landing zone is somewhere comfortable for both parties, and I find that it is rather, the deal as it is rather devoid of comfort, and it is in areas like the consultation, because this is about the future. This is not something we're going to debate. We're going to live with this for years to come. So we really need to make sure this is right.
So what's your suggestion to the way forward from here if we can't fix this? I mean, is a 3-year transition while we try and work out what the future partnership looks like a better way forward than ploughing on with this awful deal, in your words?
I think that given where we are at the moment, if we can find a way to essentially say, look, what we'll do, we will move into a transition period. We will actually then intensively work on these sort of questions together, and we will see what the scope of the possible is. We will also try to negotiate some future relationship, but in a rather more informed way than we have done to date. And if you like, I think you've got, we're not going to rewrite the withdrawal agreement now, much though I would like to. Therefore, short of an extension for a year, which I don't think people really want, I suspect the best bet is to go into a next stage and actually to try and put as much right in the next stage as possible, and that means an intensive process of reviewing where we got to, defining the future relationship in a much clearer way, and that report on what options are available in Ireland, potentially as part of a slightly separate process, I've argued, for Ireland.
Thank you. Mr. Murray, having read Mr. Henig's Twitter, I was having a little flick through a publication I think you jointly authored, Bordering Two Unions.
Yes.
Am I right on that? I was just, page 22, you had a quote that there was a profound risk in such circumstances that Ireland could be presented not as acting as a co-guarantor of the peace process, but as manoeuvring in an international organisation to coerce an end of partition, stoking age-old unionist fears and grievances. I mean, do you fear that prediction you had may have come to pass now?
Well, there could certainly be that interpretation. There's been an interpretation that some people who have been in this room have very much put upon Ireland's position in the negotiations. But to be fair to the Irish government and to respond perhaps to some of the DUP's criticisms, even if her members are no longer in the room.
Just in case you might interpret that as discourtesy, that there is an urgent question on a Northern Ireland related matter, and I suspect that's where they've gone to. So I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, but to try to take that on, the Irish government, insofar as it has been involved in the negotiations, has been involved at one stage behind the EU negotiating team. It's been there to try to set out what it believes the Good Friday Agreement requires. And if you go through the withdrawal agreement and the red lines that David Henig has set out very clearly, there's been an effort not to extend beyond the boundaries of what the Good Friday Agreement requires. And that, if you like, has almost seen a lessening of some of the protections that were in place or that were suggested by the joint report of December 2017. So the joint report of December 2017 almost set up pointed towards the possibility of Irish citizens still being able to actively bring into play their European Union citizen rights within Northern Ireland, even though it was a space outside the EU. So you could found a company in Belfast as an Irish citizen, even though Belfast was not now part of the European Union. I think there's been an awful lot of focus in the last year between Dublin and the EU team in trying to work out what the limits of EU competences are and how that actually structures the agreement. If you like, on page 22 of the book, I'm setting out the concern. That's, I think, how the Irish government have moved to address it.
So can I just add one more thing, because I hadn't realised I had what I'd set out as a possible compromise plan in front of me. There was one more thing I would have said, which is if you said we sign the withdrawal agreement on condition that we have a joint report process to report on what is possible in the Northern Ireland border, and that both sides agree that the backstop could be reopened depending on what an independent joint report would say, and that would at least that would give us some comfort that perhaps in the future you're not going to get trapped. So you can debate these things, but that's the sort of thing I was thinking of as how to fix this.
Can I just say very briefly, as background, Professor Oren Doyle, who's a law expert in Trinity, has a book recently out, and it's really about how the Irish state developed from 1921 as a separate 26-county state. So it had this rhetorical thing about United Ireland, but gradually and in every way that declined. So I think in terms of the history of the state, sort of aspirations towards unification really very much declined. I know BrExit has raised these things again, but just to make that clear.
Yeah. Good. Well, we've kept you for 2 hours. That's quite a marathon, and the questioning has been robust, and I have to say you've been more than equal to that. Really grateful to you for being with us today, and what you've said we will certainly reflect upon carefully in preparing our report on this matter. So it just remains for me to say thank you again for making the trouble to be with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Order, order.
The proceedings